As far as I can remember, I've always been able to see things. One specific encounter stays in my head. I was about 7 or 8 years old. I shared a room with my older sister, and we both slept on a full-size bed my tata gifted us. I slept against the wall because she was older and said I could fall to the floor if I slept on the other end. We always went to bed around 8:30 p.m. on school nights, and my parents always left our bedroom door open. It must have been during September or October because it was quite cool. One night I was awoken by what sounded like footsteps. I felt pressure on the bed as if someone put their knee down on it because I felt my sister roll down. The only problem is that I wasn't able to open my eyes or turn away from the wall. In my head, I told myself to turn around, and something responded back in my head, "Don't look at me." The conversation went on for what seemed like minutes before I was able to gather up the courage to turn around. As I turned to see this being, it was now holding my sister up in its arms, trying to lift her out of her bed. I gasped and pushed the little body back up against the wall. This thing laid my sister back down ever so gently and put its long, pale finger up to its non-existing mouth and said, "Shh." I wanted to scream and I wanted to yell for my dad to come help us, but nothing would come out of my mouth. I started to cry without any sound, and right as this thing began to lift my sister up again, I let out the most blood-curdling scream. "There's something in my room." This thing stared so angrily at me and dropped my sister back down. It must have been about 3 to 4 feet in height and was wearing what I could only remember describing it like the underwear swimsuit that Scooby-Doo wore in one of his episodes. This thing tiptoed out of our room and disappeared up through our ceiling right before my dad came charging in. I was so terrified. I wasn't able to ever speak about this incident until a couple years ago. My whole life I thought it was a ghost. It was only when my husband suggested that it might have been an alien and that its arms were insect-like. And that's why it walked funny. So last year I experienced something that was absolutely strange. I just keep coming back to it thinking about what this could have been, and I can't get it out of my head. I read the text conversation to my fiance from that night saved on my phone and my texts as it was happening, describing what I'm hearing and seeing, and it was just so vivid and real, I couldn't believe it. It was about midnight one night, and I was in my room at my parents' house. There are 2 windows in this room, one facing the backyard and one facing the side of the neighbor's house, and I will be referencing the one facing the backyard. This night, my blinds were shut and the overhead light in the room was on, for context, so it was not dark in the room. All of a sudden, this big blue beam of light comes rushing in through the shut blinds of the window, making a swoosh noise as it comes in. This light was bright blue. I'm talking LED blue bright, as day, even with the room lights on and the blinds shut. I'm terrified, feeling like I can't move from my bed, and as quick as it swooshes in, it swooshes back out. I hear rustling, almost raking of leaves after the light has left and the world is silent otherwise. I couldn't explain this as anything human or man-made, and this light was not a headlight. It couldn't have made it through my shut blinds over the fence and up to the 2nd floor of our house. The story doesn't end here, though. 2 weeks later, to the day, and at around the same time, the same experience. Same bright blue beam and same swooshing and raking. I told myself I would get up and see what it was this time, but I was in shock that it happened again, and once again I couldn't move. My biggest regret to this day is not looking out my window either of the nights. I've struggled with the idea of sharing my experience, mostly because I don't know if it actually happened or if it was just a dream. One night in the summer, when I was about 10 or 11, I was awake in the middle of the night and I could hear the horses running around the pasture as if something had happened. I decided to get up and go and check on things. At that time, my family had a massive old barn and we lived in the middle of nowhere. I walked through the door of the barn and found a very large man, as white as snow, climbing into the hayloft. I remember being startled, but not scared. He turned around and looked at me and slowly lowered himself back down. He took a few steps towards me before he knelt down and put out his hand, like one would do with a stray animal. As I looked at him, I felt like he looked sad and tired and not at all like he would do me any harm. So I decided to take his hand and walk him towards our kids' hangout space, which was just a space in the barn where we had some old couches, a few toys, and a radio. As soon as he saw the radio, he became more animated, ran towards it, and started messing around with it. That went on for a bit, and I kept asking him what he needed the radio for. He never said a word, not one word. He wouldn't give me a name, so I started calling him Radio. After some time, he set the radio down and sat down on the couch. I brought over my favorite horse book and started thumbing through the pages, showing him all of my favorite horse breeds. Eventually, he gently took the book from me and closed it as if to say, "I'm done." I got up to put the book away and he laid down on the couch. I remember him being so large that his head was on the armrest while his legs hung over the other armrest at the knee. He was a giant, pure white, and I don't recall any hair. His eyes were jet black, but they weren't huge or angular. If anything, they slanted downwards and were beady. After he fell asleep, I decided to go back in the house and go to bed, but I put a blanket over him before I went in. I woke up in the morning and the whole experience came flooding back to me. My feet were dirty as if I'd been outside during the night. I grabbed some snacks and ran out to the barn. I ran out to our hangout space and found everything as I would have expected it. The blanket was on the floor, the book was sitting on the table, and radio was out of place. But he was gone. It's important to know that I had a habit of sleepwalking at this time in my life, so it's possible that this was all just a dream. At first, I thought he was just a very, very, very strange person, and I hoped he found safety. The memory never left me, and by the time I was a teen, I had decided that I dreamt the whole thing and let it go. But then Prometheus came out, and I agreed to go see it with my friends. When the tall white alien came on screen, I nearly jumped out of my seat. It wasn't an exact likeness, but it was like seeing a ghost. At the time, I knew absolutely nothing about aliens, and the only one I'd ever heard of was the classic little green man. Nonetheless, I forced myself to let it go and move on. That memory could not be real, so I must have dreamt it. As time passed, I started wondering how I could have imagined a being that I'd never heard of. Could it have really happened? Could radio be real? I'm in my bed, covered in sweat, shaking and scared. This is my second experience with them. The first time they watched me, we weren't in the same room, but I could feel them watching me, and I saw their light from the space in the doorframe. It was greenish yellow. Time dilation happens when they initiate contact. Also, I don't remember hearing any sound at all during either encounter. This time was horrifying. I woke up and saw faces on my ceiling, and they weren't detailed, but they looked human. Their features were outlined with a pink light. They're interdimensional and are invisible to my knowledge. I felt two of them grab my arms, and I struggled physically. I think they were really latching onto my consciousness, but our auras are humanoid-shaped, so really they were grabbing the energy in my arms. I could feel their grip and their strength. They're smaller and weaker than us, but they have large hands and long fingers. I could feel them pulling me. Although I got out of bed and struggled physically pulling and jerking my arms out of their grip in a spasm of defensive flailing against an invisible force, I believe they were trying to separate my consciousness from my body. So in reality, my physical struggle made no difference. After the struggle, it seemed like about a minute they let go. I'm not on drugs, although mentally, physically, spiritually, I am exhausted. I believe they come for us when we are vulnerable. I survived my encounter and was able to share it, but now I wonder. When people die or have heart attacks or strokes or just collapse, were they the victims of alien abduction? Are their corpses just hollow vessels left behind by interdimensional soul thieves? On Sunday, July 18th, 2021, I was in my backyard with my mom and I wanted to test out the brand new telescope I'd just recently bought. It was finally a clear night, so I began setting it up and adjusting the lens and whatnot. After suffering for a few minutes, I was finally able to align my telescope with the moon, and I proceeded to admire all the glorious details on the moon's surface and how bright it was that night. I called my mom over to come look at the moon through the small lens. She said she wanted to see Jupiter, but I told her that it might take me a while since I was still trying to figure out how the telescope works. As I'm readjusting the position of the tripod, a weird feeling comes over me. It felt the same way as when you're walking around in public and someone keeps staring at you, and it's almost as if the stare from their eyes is burning into the back of your head. My instincts told me to turn around, so that's exactly what I did. As soon as I turned around, I noticed a very large orange glowing orb just chilling in the sky about a block away from my house. As I stood there in disbelief, my mind was trying to convince me that it's probably a plane or a helicopter. But all logical reasoning was thrown out the window when the glowing orb began to move in a bizarre zigzag motion. By the way, this all happened within a matter of like 10 seconds or less, just to clarify. The exact moment when I whipped my head around to look at it, I saw that it became frightened because I noticed it floating there, just watching me. It freaked out and started zigzagging around, and in seconds it shot away at the speed of light, gone without a single sound. To be honest, if I'd blinked during any of this, I probably would have missed it. I started panicking a little bit because I was so confused and couldn't believe what I'd just witnessed. I had so many questions. What was that? Why was it watching me? If it was extraterrestrial beings, what were they planning to do? Every time I think about this experience, it gives me chills. But it also makes me very curious to find out more about what I saw that strange summer night.